The Kremlin, Moscow, June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. The room is almost silent. A single lamp burns low over a long table covered in maps. The maps show the western frontier of the Soviet Union, a 1,000-mile line running from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Red symbols mark Soviet positions. Blue symbols mark German ones. The blue symbols have not moved. They are exactly where Soviet intelligence placed them 3 weeks ago. General Georgy Zhukov stands near the telephone. He has been standing for several minutes. He is waiting for the line to connect. The call goes through. He speaks quietly, carefully. He asks to be connected to the General Secretary. There is a long pause on the other end. Then Stalin answers. Zhukov delivers the message in measured words. German forces have crossed the frontier, on multiple axes simultaneously. The attacks began before dawn. The frontier military districts are reporting under heavy bombardment. Communications from several headquarters have already gone silent. Another pause. Stalin says nothing for a moment that stretches uncomfortably long. Then he asks Zhukov to confirm that this is not a German provocation, that Soviet troops should not, under any circumstances, return fire across the border without explicit authorization. Zhukov confirms what he has been told. It is not a provocation. Stalin does not respond immediately. Somewhere to the west, at this exact moment, 23 German tank divisions are moving east across Soviet soil. They have been moving for 3 hours. In some sectors, they are already 40 kilometers inside the border. Stalin does not yet know this. To understand what happened in those first catastrophic days, you have to understand what Soviet military leadership believed about the war they were about to fight, and why those beliefs were so deeply, catastrophically wrong. In the spring of 1941, the Red Army was the largest ground force in the world. It fielded more tanks than every other military power on earth combined. It had more artillery pieces than Germany possessed by a substantial margin. Its theoretical mobilization capacity, once fully activated, dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht could field in a sustained campaign. Soviet strategic doctrine, as articulated in the late 1930s, was built around a single governing assumption. Any future war with a major power would begin with a prolonged period of frontier combat, probing attacks, escalating pressure, diplomatic deterioration, before transitioning into full-scale operations. This period of preliminary tension would give Soviet forces time to mobilize, consolidate, and move into prepared defensive positions. Then, once the enemy's initial impetus was absorbed, Soviet forces would transition to a massive counteroffensive and carry the war onto enemy soil. This was not an unreasonable framework. It reflected the experience of the First World War. It reflected standard military planning assumptions of the era. It reflected what most European general staffs expected modern industrial warfare to look like. It reflected almost nothing about what was actually coming. Stalin himself had constructed an elaborate internal logic around the threat from Germany. He understood, at some level, that Hitler intended war eventually. But he had convinced himself, and enforced this conviction on his intelligence services, that Germany would not attack in 1941. The Wehrmacht was still engaged in Western Europe. Germany had not resolved its British problem. An attack on the Soviet Union, while Britain remained undefeated, would place Germany in exactly the two-front war it had fought disastrously in the previous conflict. This was rational analysis as far as it went. The problem was that Stalin had begun treating rational analysis as protective armour. Any intelligence report that suggested a German attack in 1941 was being screened through this framework and dismissed. There were many such reports. Through the spring of 1941, Soviet intelligence sources, including highly placed agents inside German military and diplomatic circles, delivered repeated, specific warnings. German troop concentrations in Poland and Romania were growing. Rail lines to the east were being upgraded. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft were making systematic overflights of Soviet frontier territory. German officers had been seen surveying roads near the border. One agent reported the specific date of the planned attack as June 22nd. Stalin annotated this report personally. His comment, written in the margin in red pencil, described the source as a plant, a deliberate German provocation designed to draw the Soviet Union into premature mobilization, which would then be used as justification for war. He was not entirely wrong to be suspicious of provocations. The logic of intelligence deception was real, but in constructing a wall of skepticism against false alarms, he had made himself impervious to accurate ones. By mid-June, the Western Special Military District, the command responsible for defending the Axis directly west of Moscow through Belorussia, had received enough fragmentary intelligence to be seriously alarmed. Its commander, General Pavlov, requested permission to move his forces into forward defensive positions and disperse his aircraft from their air bases. Permission was denied. Dispersing aircraft and repositioning ground forces without authorization risked provoking the very incident Stalin was determined to avoid. Frontier units were explicitly ordered not to respond to German provocations. Artillery units were ordered not to occupy prepared firing positions. In several cases, ammunition stores were kept locked. The Soviet defensive line on June 21, 1941, was a line built around assumptions that were about to be destroyed in the space of a few hours. The first German shells crossed the frontier at 3:05 in the morning Central European time. Within 15 minutes, the scale of what was happening became partially apparent to those few Soviet officers who were awake and at their posts. The bombardment was not a frontier incident. It was simultaneous along an approximately 1,800-kilometre front, from the Baltic coast to the Romanian border. German artillery and airstrikes hit Soviet communication infrastructure, headquarters buildings, fuel depots, and, with particular precision, the airfields where Soviet aircraft were parked in neat, undispersed rows. The Luftwaffe had done its reconnaissance carefully. By dawn, Soviet air assets in the frontier districts had suffered catastrophic losses. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground before pilots could reach them. In some cases, personnel ran onto the runways toward their planes and were killed by strafing runs before they arrived. The first day of the war cost the Red Air Force somewhere between 1,200 and 1,800 aircraft, the majority of them never having left the ground. This was the first crack in the system, not in the defensive line itself, but in the assumptions underlying it. Soviet defensive doctrine had anticipated air operations. It had not anticipated the near-total elimination of air capability in the forward zone within the first 12 hours. The second crack was communications. German operational planning had specifically targeted Soviet telephone and telegraph infrastructure, dedicated Luftwaffe strikes, and German special operations teams, Brandenburger units who had crossed the frontier before the main attack, systematically cut landlines and destroyed relay stations. The frontier military districts found themselves attempting to conduct corps and army-level operations with radio communications that were partially jammed, partially inoperative, and operated by staffs that had no established doctrine for functioning in communications, degraded environments. By mid-morning on June 22nd, General Headquarters in Moscow was receiving a picture of the frontier that was, at best, 6 hours out of date in some sectors, and entirely blank in others. The third crack was armour. German panzer groups were not advancing at the pace Soviet planners had modelled for mechanized forces. They were advancing faster, much faster. Army Group Centre, the strongest of the three German formation groups, had deployed Panzer Group II under General Heinz Guderian and Panzer Group III under General Hermann Hoth on converging axes north and south of the Brest-Litovsk axis. By the afternoon of the first day, Guderian's tanks had penetrated between 40 and 60 kilometers into Soviet territory. Hoth's group had achieved similar results further north. Soviet frontier units were not being pushed back. They were being bypassed. This distinction mattered enormously. A doctrine built around absorbing the initial blow and then counter-attacking assumed that the enemy advance would be a coherent forward push that created a defined front line, a line that could be identified, stabilized, and then reversed. What was actually happening was something different. German armour was moving through gaps between Soviet formations faster than those formations could reorient, leaving pockets of Soviet troops cut off behind the advancing German spearheads.
These pockets did not know they were pockets yet. Their communications were gone. Their situation maps showed positions that had become irrelevant hours earlier. They were fighting in the direction they had last been ordered to face, against German forces that in some cases had already moved 50 kilometers past them. On June 23rd, Soviet High Command issued Directive No. 3. It ordered a general counteroffensive across the entire frontier zone. The directive was not the product of accurate intelligence. It was the product of the doctrine, the unshakable conviction that once the initial German blow had been absorbed, Soviet forces should immediately seize the initiative and carry the war westward. It reflected the fundamental premise that the frontier districts, though damaged, were still coherent fighting formations capable of coordinated offensive operations. They were not. The counteroffensives ordered on June 23rd were conducted by units that were running out of fuel, had lost contact with adjacent formations, were operating under air attack with no fighter cover, and in several cases were receiving orders by motorcycle courier because radio communications had collapsed. Tank brigades moved toward their attack objectives and encountered German units that were already 30 kilometers further east than the Soviet maps indicated. The counterattacks failed almost uniformly. Where Soviet armor did achieve local penetrations, German anti-tank screens and Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft dismantled them within hours. Soviet tank losses in the first 3 days reached a number that, if it had been presented to Moscow leadership in advance, would have been considered impossible. Meanwhile, the pincers continued to close. Army Group Center's two panzer groups, having penetrated deeply on their respective axes, were beginning to curve inward toward each other, Guderian driving northeast, Hoth driving southeast, toward a meeting point near the city of Minsk, 300 kilometers inside Soviet territory. Between those two spearheads, an enormous volume of Soviet troops, elements of the 3rd, 4th, and 10th armies, were being encircled. The tempo of these events was now operating on a timescale that Soviet command simply could not match. By the time an accurate situation report could be assembled, transmitted, evaluated, and responded to in Moscow, the situation it described had already been superseded by events another 50 kilometers further east. On June 26th, 4 days after the invasion began, Guderian's forward units reached Slutsk. On June 27th, Panzer Group 3 took Minsk from the north. On June 28th, the two panzer groups linked up east of Minsk. The Minsk pocket was closed. Inside it were elements of 3 Soviet armies, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 men. The first great encirclement of Operation Barbarossa was complete. Moscow received confirmation of the Minsk encirclement through fragmentary reports that accumulated gradually rather than arriving as a single coherent assessment. The full scale of the disaster was not understood in one moment. It was assembled, piece by piece, over hours of increasingly grim communications. In the Kremlin, the atmosphere in those first days was unlike anything the institution had experienced. Stalin's behavioral pattern in crisis was, under normal circumstances, to impose his will on the situation through sheer force of authority, to demand results, set deadlines, threaten consequences. This mechanism required an opponent against whom authority could be applied. Against German armor moving at 60 kilometers a day, it had no purchase. On June 29th, Stalin arrived at the People's Commissariat of Defense, the building housing the Soviet Military High Command, and confronted the General Staff. The meeting was witnessed by several senior officers whose accounts survived the war. Stalin entered the operations room, where the duty officers were attempting to update the situation maps. The maps were heavily marked. The situation they depicted was not the situation anyone in that room had expected to be depicting a week earlier. Stalin examined them without speaking for a long moment. Then he asked questions. Where was the 10th Army? What was the status of the Bialystok grouping? Had contact been re-established with Pavlov's headquarters in Minsk? The answers, when they came, were incomplete. The 10th Army was encircled or destroyed. The Bialystok grouping was cut off and fighting in conditions of near-total isolation. Pavlov's headquarters had relocated under German air attack, and communications were intermittent. Stalin left the building. The account of what he said as he left, reportedly to his closest associates in the car, has been quoted and debated by historians for decades. The substance of it, regardless of exact phrasing, conveyed something between fury and a kind of disbelief. He returned to his dacha outside Moscow and spent approximately 2 days in a state that witnesses described as something between paralysis and withdrawal. This was not inaction in the ordinary sense. Stalin was not a man who retreated from difficulty. What his behavior in those days reflected was something more specific, a collision between his constructed understanding of reality and evidence that had become too large and too concrete to be absorbed by any interpretive framework that kept his prior assumptions intact. He had been wrong, specifically, consequentially, catastrophically wrong, about the timing of the attack, about the effectiveness of his frontier forces, about the nature of modern armored warfare, about the intelligence reports he had dismissed, about the warnings he had suppressed. Back in the operations rooms, the work continued without him. Zhukov and the General Staff were attempting to construct coherent defensive lines east of the advancing German spearheads. This required accepting, on each successive situation map, positions further east than those on the previous one. It required continuously revising downward the assumptions about what Soviet forces were still capable of. General Pavlov was recalled to Moscow on June 30th. He was arrested, tried, and shot within weeks, convicted of cowardice, dereliction, and what the indictment called criminal negligence. The charges were, in the legal sense, instruments of blame displacement. They did not survive serious historical scrutiny. Pavlov had commanded forces whose doctrine, preparation, positioning, and communications had been shaped by decisions made far above his level. But someone had to represent the magnitude of the failure in a form that could be processed, assigned, and closed. Other commands were making their own reckoning. Army Group South was encountering stiffer Soviet resistance than Army Groups North or Center. The terrain and the density of Soviet forces in Ukraine were creating conditions closer to the attritional warfare Soviet doctrine had anticipated. But even there, the operational situation was deteriorating faster than command responses could address. By early July, German spearheads were approaching the Dnieper River. The defensive line Soviet planners had imagined holding at the frontier, the Stalin line, the fortified districts, the prepared positions, had been bypassed, encircled, or simply abandoned by units that no longer existed in any coherent form. Stalin returned to active command on July 1st. The man who returned was changed in a way that his closest associates noted and did not discuss openly. The certainty that had characterized his command style, the confidence that flowed from his conviction that he understood situations others did not, had been replaced by something more functional, but more fragile. He was operating now on the evidence in front of him, rather than the model in his head. This was, in a grim way, progress. On July 3rd, he spoke publicly to the Soviet people for the first time since the invasion. The speech was notable for what it acknowledged: that the situation was serious, that German forces had penetrated deep into Soviet territory, that the threat to the nation was existential. He framed it accurately as a war for survival rather than a manageable military operation. The maps on which this speech was based showed German forces approaching Vitebsk, Mogilev, and the approaches to Smolensk, the ancient city that guarded the direct overland route to Moscow. The distance from Smolensk to Moscow was approximately 400 kilometers. German tanks had traveled more than that distance in the first 10 days. In the Smolensk operational zone, the next great encirclement was already forming. German pincers were moving around Soviet forces faster than those forces could be redeployed to meet them. The Smolensk pocket would close in mid-July, trapping another enormous concentration of Soviet troops.
But something else was happening simultaneously, something the situation maps of early July could not yet fully show. The Soviet Union was a country of continental depth and industrial capacity that had not yet been fully mobilized. Factories were being moved east of the Ural Mountains, disassembled and transported on flat cars, and reassembled in cities beyond the reach of German air power. Reserves were being formed from conscripts, whose existence the Wehrmacht had not yet fully accounted for. The Soviet capacity to absorb destruction at a scale that would shatter any other nation's military was beginning, slowly and at enormous cost, to assert itself. The Germans knew this in the abstract. Their own planning documents, including the famous assessments that noted the Red Army's ability to regenerate forces at a rate that confounded standard attrition calculations, acknowledged it. What those documents could not fully quantify was the depth of the reserves, or the industrial velocity that was beginning to turn Soviet manpower into equipped formations. But that reckoning was months away, in the operations rooms of late June and early July 1941. The map showed only what had happened. A frontier that had existed on June 21st had ceased to exist by June 22nd. 300 kilometers of Soviet territory had been lost in 10 days. The largest armoured encirclements in the history of warfare were being executed with an operational efficiency that Soviet doctrine had not modelled, and Soviet command had not anticipated. The most powerful ground army in the world had been met by a form of warfare it was not organised, equipped, or psychologically prepared to counter. Its doctrine had been built for a war that moved at a pace permitting deliberate response. The war it received moved at a pace that made deliberate response structurally impossible. Stalin had enforced the belief that others should share, that he would see the war coming, that its approach would be readable in advance. That Soviet strength was large enough to absorb miscalculations and recover. The maps told him otherwise. They told him in a language that could not be reinterpreted or annotated away. Red symbols gone. White space where formations had been. Blue lines moving east at a rate that made each day's briefing a diminishment of the previous one. He had not seen it coming. His frontier armies had not absorbed it. And the war that was now unfolding was not the war Soviet planning had designed for. There is a particular quality to strategic failure at the highest level. The way a catastrophe does not announce itself all at once, but arrives in increments, each one individually manageable in the telling, each one part of a pattern that only becomes visible when the map is stepped back from, and the whole picture is seen at once. Stalin stepped back from that map in late June of 1941 and saw a picture that could not be made to mean anything except what it meant. The initiative had passed. The design had failed. The war was now being fought on terms chosen by the enemy, in territory that had been Soviet a week before, by formations that were dying faster than command could account for them. The architects of Soviet strategic planning had built their assumptions carefully, argued for them forcefully, and defended them against contrary evidence with the full weight of institutional authority. The German armoured columns did not slow for any of it.